Are we
All right, we're live. Yay!
So
Welcome back to Let's Talk Coronavirus, folks.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. We're really excited to be back on, and we have a huge welcome to our newest Beloiters who are joining us on Let's Talk Coronavirus as part of their first Beloit College class. So, yay! So COVID-19, a pandemic is more than a virus or a disease class. We're really glad that you're here. So again, I'm Rachel Bergstrom. I teach in the biology department and in the Health and Society program. I'm also the director of the first year advising and mentoring program with Joy De Leon. So welcome. And I'm here with two other people. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Ron Watson. I am a professor of political science and health and society, which is our public health program. And I am co-chair of the health and society program. So it's good to see you all and to be back doing the coronavirus thing. Phil, take it away, my man. You're on mute, Phil.
On mute. I thought I was unmuted. I am Phil Chen, and I am a assistant professor of political science, studying political psychology, and I have a 1.5-year-old dropping things on the on the floor upstairs, which you might hear. And yeah, so I am a newer addition to Let's Talk Coronavirus. So, and I'm going to go back on mute.
We're delighted that you're here, Phil. It's great to have more people joining us. And so for people who have been here in the past, welcome back again. Just to give you a little heads up, we are starting kind of from scratch again, not completely, but starting from the very beginning again. It's been a while since we talked about the basic biology and some of the basic questions of epidemiology and public health. And so in our course that we're teaching along with this, our students are joining us on Mondays for a discussion on Zoom with just the small group, and then they're joining this conversation. They've provided actually some really great questions for us to discuss today to lead our conversation. And so we'll be diving into those. We are going back to, for this week and the following 6 weeks, we will be here every Wednesday. Hooray! And we've got a great list of faces and people from across the Beloit College campus to talk about how this pandemic is more than just the disease COVID-19. So we've got a few returning guests with some new questions to address. And so with that, let's just jump in to our questions. So where should we start, people?
Well, I'm thinking, since we've got a bunch of new folks in, maybe we start talking about what COVID-19 itself actually is, right? And some of what I saw from the students, some of them learned sort of newly that COVID-19 is not the same thing as the coronavirus, right? And so maybe we can just start there talking about that distinction and then move into some questions.
Great. That is a great place to start. So this is a common situation that we've got across all infectious diseases. So when we think about a disease and we think about, what a disease is, we've got kind of an interconnected network of things that actually are the disease. Okay. And so the first thing is we have what epidemiologists call an agent. Okay. And this agent is the thing that gets inside of you that starts wreaking havoc on your system that causes the disease. And when we're talking about the disease is kind of more of the manifestation of that interaction between the agent and you, which is what we call the host, okay? So an agent gets inside of a host and causes the disease, the symptoms, okay? So in the case of COVID-19, we have a virus that's called a SARS-CoV-2, okay? And Am I saying that right? Yeah, I just had a brain fart where I was like, oh my gosh, am I saying the right thing? Yes, I'm saying the right thing. You know, when you say something over and over again and it's just like, am I, what? So SARS-CoV-2. So SARS-CoV-2 might sound familiar too, because several years ago, like almost a decade, more than a decade ago.
More than a decade ago, yeah.
Yeah, 2007 it was, right?
I think so, yep.
Yeah. 2007, we had an outbreak of SARS, right? So SARS, and now we've got a virus name. So SARS is the name of that disease that we had an outbreak of. It was caused by SARS-CoV-1, or what's being called SARS Classic, okay? And so there we've got the virus and the disease have the same name. This is kind of similar to like influenza, the flu that we get every year. It's an influenza virus, and there's some more naming to that. And the disease is actually called influenza. So like Ebola virus disease is caused by the Ebola virus. We've got some differences there. So one of the challenges is, since a decade ago, we had that disease called SARS, and it was caused by this virus, that now our virus looks very similar to that particular virus. We now have two SARS-CoV viruses going on. One caused SARS, but this one's different enough, and the disease that it causes is different enough that we needed a different name for the actual disease. Okay, and so the disease is called COVID-19, and it's coronavirus disease, started in 2019. So when we talk about it, sometimes people talk about them interchangeably, but when we're talking about SARS-CoV-2, we're talking about the actual agent. And when we're talking about COVID-19, we're talking about the actual disease, the symptoms, the pathology, the things that are happening to you as a human host for that particular disease. So one other fun fact that we talked about in class this week that might be useful for our broader audience too is that it's good to know that viruses are not technically alive, and viruses can't do anything when they're in our system. Virus is an agent that absolutely needs a host in order for it to be able to make copies of itself to go on to infect other people. And that will become really important for us as we talk about herd immunity, which might actually be a good segue into herd immunity.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions, so Ron, tell me a little bit about herd immunity.
All right, so this idea of herd immunity, what's interesting is we had a reading this, I guess, a couple of days ago now, where we discussed what some authors were talking about, how herd immunity is actually something that requires a lot more than what we actually think. And for one thing, in order to get herd immunity or get to a level of herd immunity, we really can't really be in the middle of a pandemic to do that. It almost requires a vaccine. Now, the question, of course, we back up, what is herd immunity? Herd immunity is when we reach a number of people who are typically vaccinated against the disease, so much so that the disease, whenever a person who has it or has that agent in them, whenever they are surrounded by people, that they're surrounded by so many people who are actually immune to it, that it doesn't have anywhere to go. And then it effectively just can't propagate in the community, right? And so we call that herd immunity. And that actually acts to protect a variety of folks, both those who are just not immunized or vaccinated against the disease, but also those who cannot, such as small children and those who have a variety of different medical conditions that make it impossible for them to vaccinate. But that sort of leads to, I guess, this question here that I'll pick, which is, and one of the students asked, is herd immunity a viable solution to COVID, or will it prove to be ineffective due to outside circumstances? I mean, I think this is a great question, and I have my own take on this, but I'll throw this to Phil and Rachel and see what they think as well.
Yeah, so herd immunity is a really it's a hopeful thing too, right? I think that we've seen it work, and we've actually, in all honesty, the only disease that we've eradicated from the planet that we have managed to wipe off the face of the planet. We've had no natural infections since 1977-ish, late 1970s, is smallpox. And we're working our way towards eradication of polio using the same sort of idea of herd immunity. to block the transition. So if we remember that you absolutely have to get the virus into a host in order for it to make copies of itself to go on to the next host. If you stop having hosts available for the virus to replicate in, you can't make more, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that requires a high percentage. And for measles, for example, measles is one of the most contagious diseases that we deal with. It's also one that we have a really effective vaccine for. Measles, you need to get about 95% of the people immunized, okay, in order to have this herd immunity. So, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Rachel, I mean, I think that's actually a really good jumping on point, right? Because if you all will remember, before COVID hit and sort of took our minds away, and then of course everything that's happened after, you'll remember that there was now an outbreak, or there had been several outbreaks of measles once again in the United States and in Europe. And if you really look at the immunization rates, I mean, the immunization rates we're talking about are still, you know, in most cases over 80%, right? In the late 70s, early 80% range. But that just goes to show you that that's actually not enough, right? For a disease like measles, is that, you know, it has to be like 95% in order for us to talk about measles being effectively eradicated. So sorry, jump back.
No, I think that's a great point that, you know, countrywide in the United States, we've got a pretty good immunization rate, but we've got these pockets of areas in the United States where there's lower immunization rates, right? And so I think that even within that 95%, so the idea is that, sorry, let me back up for a second. The idea is with that herd immunity, again, just as Ron had said, we're protecting people who can't get the immunization. But the other thing that we're doing with herd immunity is we're preventing massive outbreaks. So we're preventing, like, one person might still get measles. That'll happen, right? I mean, that's just the way that life works. But that one person isn't going to start a chain reaction of other people getting infected, going on and on and on and on and on, because they've got people in between them and the next person who are immunized, right?
Right.
So in the case of this ongoing pandemic, think about, like, measles is still rare enough that when there's cases, they're reported to, well, there's a lot of diseases that we report, but it's something that shows up on the news. When we've got like 2 or 3 cases of measles, it shows up on the news because it's still pretty rare. COVID is not rare, right? And right now, there's so many people who are able to pass the virus on to the next person that even if we were to achieve, it's unreasonable for us to think about using herd immunity to stop the outbreak. So think of herd immunity as more of a mechanism to prevent outbreaks when you've got it under control, less of a mechanism to control the outbreak once it's out of control.
So let me jump in there too. I mean, because this is, I think, one of the points that the authors of the article we had the students read made, and I think this is critical to understand. Yes, in theory, and I do want to say in theory, because there is actually some evidence that that having gotten COVID and recovered from it, that even if you have antibodies, we're not sure. We are at this point not certain that that will protect you from a future COVID infection. Okay, so let's just say that. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is that if we go and we say, all right, let's just not take off masks, because a number of the questions were like, well, you know, is it better to wear a mask and delay herd immunity, or just, you know, take the mask off and you know, see what happens and let everyone sort of get it? So again, this isn't really like chickenpox, which can also be dangerous. Let's just keep that in mind. But COVID-19 is a disease that has a very serious fatality rate, as I hope that you all can appreciate and understand. So yeah, in theory, you could do that. You could be like, all right, just let's all let ourselves get infected with COVID-19 and then we move forward. The problem is that in a country of 330 million people, you are effectively consigning millions of people to die, right? I mean, that's what it boils down to. And because if we think about what will happen, is that even if only 1 or 2% of those people get, serious enough symptoms to lead to death, we're talking about effectively millions of people, and that is, well, what's the word I'm looking for? Immoral, right? So that's not okay to do. But again, if you have a vaccine, and once a vaccine is developed, and I think most of us are confident that in the next year, if not sooner, there'll be a vaccine. That once that happens, and people properly go and get vaccinated, then we can actually create herd immunity, right? And that's actually what we want, especially when we're in the middle of an active outbreak. So anyway, that's my 25 cents on that. I got a whole lot of change in my pocket, so let's keep going.
As the non sort of public health and more of the policy slash public opinion expert here, I'm going to defer a lot of these to Rachel and Ron, but I'm going to try to pose a question here that's something that kind of comes up in a lot of the questions that our students submitted, which is this idea of herd immunity has been talked about by various different political elites as sort of a default or an option in sort of instead of a vaccine, right? Or instead of social distancing. But in fact, I think one of the big things we have to wrestle with is that herd immunity is how vaccines also work, right? That herd immunity is not a sort of a containment strategy. It is a sort of a function of viruses, right? Or a function of diseases. So I think one of the questions that I want to pose that students and I think a lot of other people are wrestling with is we have known cases of people being infected with coronavirus and COVID-19 multiple times. So while it may convey immunity, it's not, that isn't sort of a known quantity at this point. Is it possible, or how can we develop vaccines that convey immunity if the virus itself does not seem to always convey immunity? Is there a way to develop vaccines for a virus or for a disease that doesn't convey sort of natural immunity? And how does that work?
So I have a really interesting question or answer to this, Phil, but I want to make sure that we understand a few just baseline things about vaccines and this idea of lasting immunity from an infection, because it's really important to know that. So we've got this idea of you can become immune to a disease by having the disease, okay? Or you can become immune to a disease by having a vaccine for the disease. And so there's some confusion in the popular press about what it actually means to get the disease and get immune to it. And I'm talking about, let's use measles again, because that's a vaccine that we know works extremely well, right? So getting measles is going to give you immunity to the disease. We know that. Getting chickenpox is going to give you immunity to chickenpox. I had chickenpox, but most of my students right now have never had chickenpox because they've gotten the vaccine, right? And so they're not going to get the chickenpox because they've had the vaccine. Those things, those immunities are happening by the same basic mechanism. It's a host response. So the host themselves is having an immune response, and that immune response confers lasting immunity through things called memory cells and antibodies. And so when you get a disease, when you get a disease or when you get a vaccine, that's a thing that we call non-self that's introduced to your body, yourself. And your immune system recognizes that as non-self, and it says, "Ooh, get out, and never come back again." And it basically puts up a wanted poster for you, for that particular non-self thing, for that virus, so that the next time it sees it, it's like, no, the door is closed, you are out, you are gone, we're going to manage you, we are done with you. Okay. And so as Phil has rightly stated, we have various different levels of immunity that you can get, and by levels, I mean, you can have The next time your body sees it, you can have a weak immune response. So it's kind of like, oh no, stay out. We're gonna try and keep you out. Or it can be like, ah, I am done. You are done. Out, right? So we can have different levels of immunity, and we can have a different amount of time that our immune system is remembering it. Okay. And so that goes for both the infection by the agent or by the introduction of the vaccine. Okay. So we can get those at the same time. So for the most part, where the difference comes in, for the most part, our vaccinations have very, 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 very few risks associated with them. We know how many people have had adverse reactions to every single one of the vaccines because we keep track of that. Okay, so for most people, the response is going to be some sort of mild immune response, which we associated with like some pain at the site of injection, maybe a little low-grade fever, especially associated with measles vaccination. But for disease, the complications are myriad. Okay, and so for measles, we know that most of the baby boomers survived through childhood measles. But we're also learning more and more and more now about other risks associated with actually getting the measles. Mm-hmm. So you might have lifelong immunity from that, but you're also running a lot of risks. Whereas with vaccinations or immunizations, I guess we should be calling them immunizations, you have fewer risks. Okay, so that's some background. And now we're getting to this question of, is it possible to have a long-term immune response to in the case of a vaccine or an immunization or a disease, if it's like COVID and we see that you have a short-term immunity following, maybe that's what we've got. The answer is that we already have a mechanism in place for that. And so if you think about it, many of you have received boosters, right? Booster shots. Yep. One of the big ones that adults, so you get a bunch of booster shots throughout childhood, and in many cases that gives you long-term immunity, and like a good robust immune response when your body sees that. But another one that you probably will be receiving boosters for about every 10 years for the rest of your life, should you need it, is the tetanus shot. Okay, and so what we know is that you can have a certain amount of immunity over time to tetanus, and getting down towards about 10 years, it's decreasing the strength of the immune response. So in terms of COVID, if we had, let's say we have a year of protection from a vaccine, what do? 1 year later, we get a booster shot. And the cool thing about that is that you have a stronger immune response to boosters the second time that you've been exposed to that particular thing. And the idea is that if you're exposed to it, then you have an immune response and you can fight it and you get the benefits of that immune response. So it's a great question. I don't know the specifics around COVID, but we have some mechanisms in place and experience working with those types of agents.
Right on.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to follow this up then with sort of a question for Ron, which is around the sort of political history or the public health history of vaccinations or immunization requirements. We have at various points required these. So the question, of course, is if a vaccine is developed, how is it possible, or do we have a history of requiring vaccinations at various points? So I'll turn it over to Ron for that, and I can kind of speak to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so what's interesting, right, is that the responsibility for guaranteeing people get vaccinated or mandating vaccination has in the United States typically fallen to the states. Okay, and so this is the area of this I think I can speak best about. It's typically fallen to the states. Now, here's the interesting question, right? If I were to ask you which state in the country has the best vaccination rate, what would you say?
Mm.
Like if you had to choose one, and people, you can, those of you who are listening, you can add in the chat and let us know what you're saying there. And we'll see if, since Rachel has Facebook open because she's a multitasking queen, we can see if she has any, what people are saying, but feel
Yeah,
free
we
to
got to give them a 5 to 10 second delay because, you know, so we'll do some Jeopardy music. Oh, we've got our first guest from an alum, JP Marquez, Colorado.
Oh, so Colorado has the best. Okay, that's a good guess. Good guess. Anyone else?
So let's see. Can I guess? Wait,
No.
I think I know.
You can't guess because we gave a lecture on this like 2 years ago.
I can guess.
True.
No, you can guess.
Oh, we got another guess that in Sweden they've got a good vaccination rate.
I mean, probably. I'm thinking U.S. states though, right?
Yeah. Oh, New York, and Minnesota.
Okay, awesome. So why don't we go ahead and stop there because those are all wrong.
Oh, and California.
And California is definitely wrong. So the best in the country, at least a couple of years ago, was Mississippi. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And the worst was Colorado.
Oh, shoot.
Boom. Now, here's the question. Why? This is what we always want to ask. Why? And so what this comes down to is the number of instances in which a state says that it's okay not to vaccinate, right? This is the so-called, of course, the word's going to escape me now that I need it, but when you have any, within the states, there are any number of sort of exemptions you can get, okay? And depending on which state you live in, there are more possible exemptions. So Mississippi, as it turns out, from I think sometime in the late 70s, decided to get rid of exemptions like religious exemptions, right? Non-medical exemptions, it may be sort of broadly spoke, right? Which includes religious exemptions and exemptions based on just, you know, philosophical, you might say philosophical exemptions, right? Like I don't want to do it because I don't believe in it, right? Mm-hmm. So as a consequence, that state's vaccination rate was over 90%, like, you know, well over 90%. Colorado, of course, allows for even sort of these philosophical exemptions, right? Which is, you know, I don't have any religious reason. I just, you know, I don't feel right about it. I'm not okay with it. And California used to as well until that measles outbreak happened at Disneyland a couple years back. And that sort of spurred action. So, you know, Phil, while I can't give like a full on, you know, full history of it, I can talk about that relationship with the states. And it really does come down to the number of exemptions that your state allows and what kind of exemptions your state allows.
So
yeah, I think that's really a great sort of way to approach this. And I think I've had this conversation a few times with students. I'll speak a little bit. Some of my research deals with the courts, not with court decisions. I'm not a legal scholar. But one of the big things that we often hear is, well, okay, this infringes on my sort of rights, my right to free speech, or however broadly conceived. And I think the important thing to remember is that there is a long history in the United States of the federal government or states overriding sort of constitutional rights. There's this lay perception that rights are always yours, that you have an inalienable right, but that's not actually the way that our court system works. When the government thinks that they need to infringe on or to override your rights, it's subject to something called strict scrutiny, which is basically the policy that's put in place has to serve a compelling state interest, be narrowly tailored, and be sort of directed at that specific state interest. And so we have a long history of public health policies that you would think would say, well, I have a right to not be vaccinated. Well, no, you don't actually, if it meets the criteria of strict scrutiny. And this dates back all the way to the early 1900s, Jacobson v. Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. That is the sort of the core concept of strict scrutiny and a compelling state interest. And so we absolutely have to remember that the federal government or state governments can require public health measures that you might say, I don't want to do that. I have a right to not do that. Well, you actually don't have a right if it meets those sort of compelling state interest, strict scrutiny requirements that the Supreme Court has put in place.
So Phil, before you move on, is Jacobson versus Massachusetts, is that the smallpox vaccination case?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Having that context, I think, is helpful.
Yeah, so this is not a case that I teach all that often, but essentially what it was is, I believe Cambridge, Massachusetts, wanted to require their, and I'm gonna butcher this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly certain that the gist of it is, Cambridge wanted to require residents or school children or something to get the smallpox vaccine. And some people sued, Jacobson being one of them. And then the court ruled in favor of Massachusetts and the city of Cambridge, saying you can require this if it, for a public health reason, assuming that it meets, it has met these requirements. Again, the horrible butchering, and my legal scholar friends would be ashamed that was my telling of it, but essentially it's a case of compelling state interest.
Well, I think that's really an important, that's a good enough summary, I think, for our purposes here, right? Because it is saying that there has been this isn't just scientists coming in and saying that for the good of everybody, we need to think about the public health measures here. We need to think about the science of it. It's also having multiple different people and multiple different aspects of our community and of our nation involved in taking care of people, right? And it is through things like those decisions that we literally were able to eradicate smallpox, to get to a point where that's a disease that we don't worry about anymore. And people die from smallpox. They die.
So let me jump on really quickly. I think there are a couple of questions that our students pose that might be pretty easy to answer, but are also pretty fun questions, actually, right? So we've got one from Abe, who says something along the lines of, so what happens when the permafrost melts and releases unknown pathogens or reintroduces diseases like smallpox into the environment? Does immunization or herd immunity still help us? I will just tell you that it all depends, right? It all depends on what those pathogens are. And I think that this is, right now, a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a sort of marginal concern for most of us at this point, right? But when it does happen, maybe it won't be. It could turn out that the melting of the permafrost doesn't really release anything into the environment that isn't already there, right? Meaning diseases that we've already dealt with in the past and so on and so forth. Of course, that is a concern. How much of an active concern it is up for debate, right? But certainly it will be some issue there. But yeah, it all depends on what is released. So anyway, Rachel, I'll toss this over to you because it's, I saw you get a big smile on your face when you start talking about this too. Go ahead.
Yeah, I get excited about this. I think this is a great question because again, it's another opportunity for us to pull in other areas of interest and other areas of expertise to start thinking about what human disease is all about. This is a climate change question, right? Yeah, and it's thinking about what I mean, we can talk about carbon, we can talk about all of it. It's really exciting, right? And so Ron's exactly right. We have examples of this already too, where permafrost or areas that have been frozen for decades or even years melt. One of the interesting ones that my students in emerging diseases have really latched onto, for some reason, I've had several papers over the past few years about this, but anthrax.
Anthrax, right? Yeah, that's the one, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and anthrax is an ancient disease. We have we're pretty good at dealing with it, but we also know of anthrax from bioterrorism perspectives. It's a soil-borne pathogen. It's a bacteria, which is different than a virus. But again, it's not the sort of thing that we are really good at in large doses dealing with as humans. It kind of tends to kill us. It kills a lot of livestock. Usually that's one of the things that we see in response to these permafrost melting things, is we see livestock who are feeding on the area wind up dying. I think that's a great question, and it's something to really pay attention to over the next few years. But Ron's right. It depends. It could be stuff, it could be stuff that we've seen before. There's one of my students in the previous few years has been talking about, well, what happens when the people who were buried in the permafrost who died from smallpox are exhumed, so it's a good question. So something to pay attention to.
Yeah, right on. If it's all right, I want to jump into another one of the questions that I saw as well. This one from Max, coming to us from Facebook. Will the rising number of those who are sort of anti-vaccination, will that seriously reduce the success of the vaccine? Phil, this ties almost directly back into what we were talking about, right? Given what we've seen over the past, let's say over the past 20 years, with the quote unquote success of the anti-vaccination movement, and then the end result, which was the outbreak of measles for the first time in a decade. What are your thoughts on this? I have some of mine, but what are your thoughts?
So I have a lot of thoughts on this, but first, can I kick this over to Rachel to ask the sort of background question, which is how much, at what point of vaccination, how does that vary by disease? Like what level of vaccination in the population? Because that's a big question, right? If only 20% of the population is anti-vax and you only need 60% of the population to be vaccinated, then it's a different question. If you need 90 or 95, like you said, for measles, it's a different story. And of course, we don't have vaccines, we don't know, but are there ways to guess?
Yes, and this is a great question. I was just pulling this out of our student questions. One of the students asked about how do we know what that percentage is? And so this is related to a term called R-naught. You might have heard R-naught before as something about, how bad you might have heard the term, we're trying to get an R-naught of 1, right? That's something. So R-naught is the reproduction number for the particular pathogen. And it's very different according to a lot of different factors, including how easy is it to transmit. So measles has a high R-naught. I think I just looked this up before we met today because I wanted to have the right numbers. Measles has had an R-naught of 3.7 to 207 estimate, anywhere in there. And what this means is that one person with measles goes into a susceptible population, so people who aren't already immune, they can infect about 3.7 people average, or up to 207. So you think about then those 207 people go on to infect the next 207, and you do some exponential math and you're like,
and measles is an extraordinarily successful pathogen. That's just, but please continue.
No, and so this R-naught, so if it's a more infectious disease like that, and you're more likely to pass it to more people, just statistically speaking, you need to have a higher percentage of the population immunized. Okay, and so it's an inverse relationship. Well, no, there's a fraction. It's an inverse, 1 minus an inverse, okay, of the R-naught. 1 minus 1 over the inverse of R-naught is generally how they calculate that. And so I've seen various different R-naughts for COVID.
Mhm.
Anything from 2 to 6 to 0.8 to something. And it's important to know that the R naught is situational, it's fluid, it requires a lot of different things. And so we don't actually know. The R naught in the United States is very different than the R naught was in Italy, is very different than the R naught is in Sweden, it's very different than the R naught in Finland, those sorts of things. But the estimates that I've heard for a guess at herd immunity, and again, it's a guess, are much lower than I was expecting, 50 to 60% of
50 to 60. That's what I hear too. Yep.
yeah. So it's something that I'm not entirely sure what to say about that, but the R naught of 2 to 2.5 is one of the recent estimates that I found, which is higher than influenza, but it's still imperfect. Anyhow, so does that give you a good place to start, Phil?
Yeah, absolutely. And so so in that sense, what we would say is, now, of course, my guess, again, Rachel, you can correct me, is that if we get over 60%, we get to 80 or 90% of vaccination, that's going to make it a more effective vaccine, not for the individual, but a quicker time to reducing or to eliminating COVID in the population. That's my assumption, right?
It's going to do a better job of preventing outbreaks. So again, I mean, we have to remember that there's a fine line between herd immunity leading to no infections versus herd immunity leading to less, or like a lower likelihood of outbreaks. So, but you're thinking about it, right?
Right. And so what I will tell you is this. Here's your sneak preview of some data that my co-author, Christina Farhart, who's at Carleton College in Minnesota, and and we've lost Ron, but hopefully he can come back. So the quick sort of top line of this is we have measures of vaccine skepticism in here. And what we find is, so we ask, one of the questions is, let me get the exact wording. I'm completely confident that vaccines are safe. And what we find is about 6% of our sample, and this is a quota sample of US residents. So not a sort of gold standard representative, but set to census parameters. About 6% of people strongly disagree with that statement, that they are completely confident that vaccines are safe, and about 10% somewhat disagree with that statement. So you're talking about 16% who have some level of disagreement with the idea that vaccines are safe. And then when we look at the statement, when everyone else is vaccinated, I don't have to be vaccinated too. And what we see is much higher levels of agreement there. So about 10% of people strongly agree with the statement that they don't have to be vaccinated if everyone else is, and about 11-12% somewhat agree with that. So we do, like Max is talking about, see a fairly significant population and we have other measures in here. We can construct into a full scale of vaccine skepticism. So on the first count, yes, that's absolutely right. We do see sort of an increasing number, or at least a high enough percentage. But the sort of hopeful thing is it doesn't reach that sort of 40% threshold, right? It's not, we're not seeing 50% of the population saying that they are, skeptical of vaccinations. The other thing we do is we ask, if a coronavirus vaccine becomes available, how likely are you to get that vaccine? And fortunately, what we see is that around 80% of say they are extremely, very, or somewhat likely to get a coronavirus vaccine. So that's actually good news.
Yeah.
Right? Only 10-ish% say they're not very likely, and only about 9% say not likely at all. Now, of course, that will change depending on when the vaccine becomes available, things like that. Now, the big connector, after I've rambled for this amount of time, is, does vaccine skepticism predict your likelihood of saying you will get the vaccine? And the short answer, not surprisingly, is absolutely.
Okay, good.
So if you say vaccine, if you strongly agree that vaccines are safe, versus strongly disagreeing. If you move that whole range, you're about 60% less likely to get the vaccine. So if you agree that vaccines are safe versus saying that that you strongly disagree that they're safe, that's about a 60-point movement. And on that other vaccine skepticism, what I talked about, it's a smaller movement. It's about 16 points, but it's still a significant movement. And so taken together, vaccine skepticism is absolutely a driving force in whether people will or will not get vaccinated. And of course, this is all preliminary. It's not peer reviewed yet. We're working on a bunch of different things, but the sort of top line results seem to suggest that vaccine skepticism is a piece of the puzzle that we have to consider.
Well, and Phil, I think it's interesting to be thinking about this idea of vaccine skepticism in the context of we are living through a disease, a viral disease. It's a little bit different than measles has been mostly removed from our consciousness, right? We don't see that on a regular basis. And when we do, like I said, it's a newsworthy event. I also heard from Ron, just to let you know, he's trying to get back in, but he's got internet problems. So I wonder too, like the 80% who say that if a vaccine is available, they'll get it. I wonder, where they fit into the skepticism continuum,
So say that again, the people who said they may or may not?
So you said that 80% of people said that they would be likely to seek a vaccine, right? I don't think that all of those 80 people are like, yes, I 100% fully trust every single vaccination that I've ever heard about.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that we had another question from Janaya on Facebook here that's related to this. Like why do people not trust vaccines, right? Where does this come from? Okay. And so there's her question is a little bit more specific than that. And it's, can you get a disease from the vaccine that's supposed to prevent it? And then second of all, why do some vaccines have live pathogens, but others have killed pathogens? This is a great question. And this is one of those things that a misunderstanding about these particular questions kind of affects the way that people view vaccinations. And so the first question is, can you get a disease from a vaccine that's supposed to prevent it? And the answer is no. In most cases, as she's also pointed out here very rightly, there's some vaccines that have what we call a live attenuated version of the pathogen or the agent, and others have parts of the agent. And so the way that your immune system works is that it recognizes little bits of the, Ron's back. Welcome back. He'll be on here too, don't worry. It recognizes parts of the pathogen, the agent itself. And so when you get, the whole virus in you, it's going to recognize different bits of it and build its antibodies, and you'll have immunity to that. But we can kind of like drill down and think about parts of the virus that your immune system is going to recognize and only put those parts in. And so when we're only putting the parts in, you're definitely not going to get the disease. So one of the things that I've heard though is that people get the influenza immunization and they're like, oh, I got the flu from the influenza immunization. And while it might be true that they had some symptoms of the immune response, such as like a mild fever, some soreness, muscle aches, soreness at the site of the injection, that's actually a sign of your immune system ramping up to respond to that. Right. So one of the ones that I know is of concern though is one of these live attenuated vaccines, and that would be measles. Measles is a live attenuated vaccine. And what live attenuated means is that this vaccine, this what they're putting into you is a virus that's competent to make copies of itself. But the attenuated is key here. Attenuated means that it's weakened. And so for most people with functioning immune systems, this is another caveat, you have to have a functioning immune system to be able to do this, to be able to mount a response, but also to be able to deal with the live attenuated versions. The live attenuated, it'll get into your cells, it'll make some copies of it. It won't cause the disease that we associated with it, but it will make some copies of it. And that's actually of benefit because that gives your body a chance to form a bigger immune response to it. And so the question of why do some have live pathogens and some live attenuated pathogens and some have killed like whole virus pathogens or chunks of it, it's just because that's what we found works for those particular types of viruses. And so for COVID, they're looking at a few different versions of vaccines. So they're looking at the one where they basically chunk it up, and they've got these things on the outside of the virus called spikes. So they're trying to, put those spikes in there in the vaccine. Your body sees those spikes. It recognizes those spikes in by themselves. And so when you see the virus, it says, ooh, spikes, I know those, I can kill them. That's one way that we've done it. The second is really interesting. They've just put a little bit of genetic material into you to try and get your body to produce those spikes and then to get your immune response. So we got a few different things. I don't think, have you heard of any live attenuated vaccines for this? I think we don't know enough about COVID to where I'd feel at all comfortable with that idea, because I'd be very concerned about it. So one last thing, because there's also another case of in polio. There's two different versions of the vaccine. There's one that's live attenuated, and there was one that's chunks. We don't use the live attenuated one in the United States anymore. This is one case where as we get to the point where we're trying to completely eradicate the disease, we now see cases of polio where the vaccine version has reverted to an infectious version that causes the disease. And so that is the one exception to this. It's very, it's very nerve-wracking to hear about that, but we're not concerned about that with measles. We've been doing, enough people have been vaccinated with measles vaccine with the live attenuated. So it's something to be aware of. So, but these are really good questions about vaccinations, and these are some of the things that definitely lead to some wariness around vaccines. And especially with the measles vaccine, there's a lot of other things that lead to that wariness too. So,
I mean, I think we also can't downplay the role of misinformation around vaccines.
Yes, let's talk about it.
Yes, let's talk about that.
There's huge amounts of misinformation about the, supposed sort of, consequences is not the right word I'm looking for, side effects of vaccines that have been repeatedly disproven scientifically. But there's a psychological mechanism here that breeds this kind of misinformation, right? People are not good at dealing with ambiguity. And so when there are cases of ambiguity, they tend to try to ascribe a causal story. And so one of, I think, the most problematic, the really sticky pieces of misinformation around vaccines is this one-time studies associating the MMR vaccine with increased cases of autism. Now, we know that study has been disproven. We know that it's not true. But you have to think about the way that statistics work and the way that the mind works. And so in this one, it's really interesting because kids get their MMR vaccines around that sort of, I should know this. When did Rosie start getting her MMR? It was 12 months, I think, 1 year. And then, they keep getting boosters for a while after. That's also the age when it becomes easier and more likely for kids to be diagnosed with autism.
That's right.
And so there's this convergence of factors that is not driven by a causal relationship, but people want to attribute something that is unknown. We don't really know what causes autism. We have ideas, we have correlations, but we don't really have a causal story for autism. But so when you're dealing with ambiguity, when you're dealing with highly sort of emotional, stressful situations, the psychological tendency is to find something to explain it. And so so a lot of people have sort of glommed onto this disproven study because it's a way to explain something that we just don't have an explanation for. Ron, I'm sure you have other thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's, and as a parent, and I tend to be, I'm sort of a pretty cautious parent, right? And so I appreciated and understood what people were saying. A lot of folks were saying about their concerns around, especially the MMR vaccine and its potential to cause autism. And I'm a bit older too, right? So I was hearing what those folks were saying who were largely around my age. And on some level, while I get it, it is exactly what you said, Phil, right? There are two things I want to say. One is I want to remind people about this, like, correlation is not causation. And one of the best examples from public health is, of course, we all know that eating ice cream causes polio, right?
And murders.
Yes.
Wait, what? I didn't know
this.
Ice cream causes polio and murders.
Right. Okay. Let me back up. All right. So one of the things that we noticed in the 50s, before we had an effective vaccine for polio, was that during the summer months, of course, we would see, and folks would draw these charts. We would see this ramp up in like ice cream truck sales. And right alongside that, we would see this ramp up in cases of childhood polio. And so the assumption there is that, oh man, there might be something in milk or in ice cream that is causing this. I mean, it couldn't be ruled out, right? Of course, we look at it now, we go, that's dumb, right? But it's not dumb. These two events are happening closely in time. Yes, human beings hate ambiguity. And we also have this other gift/curse of seeing patterns everywhere, right? Including where they don't exist, right? And so when you put all of that together, it's like, wait a minute, these two things happen, boom, right? Our sort of stereotype heuristic goes into overdrive, and there we go. That's what's causing it. So that's sort of clearly an issue, right? We have to keep in mind that that's not happening. But here's the other side of the anti-vaccination piece that I think is important for us to keep in mind. To the extent that one might argue that, okay, I think that this vaccine causes autism, right? Again, given that we can't figure out what is causing it, I understand the concern. But if you make the choice not to vaccinate your child and you wait until they're 6 or 7 years old, now what's the excuse?
Yeah.
So, I mean, at that point, we have no issues here, right? We know that to the extent that you might be worried about when they're 1.5 about this causing something, by the time they're 6 or 7 years old, even that concern is no longer a concern. And yet, if you continue to insist on not vaccinating your child, that now has gone into a completely different level of problem, right? So those are the two things I want to say on that, right? And we're, oh my gosh, I'm looking at.
And I will quickly add, the part of the reason why I think we see that is what we refer to as motivated reasoning.
Yes.
In psychology.
Exactly.
This idea that once you have a belief, you tend to be motivated to support that belief. Exactly. And so once you form that belief early on, you tend to discount information that counters that belief and prioritize information that supports that belief. That's called directional motivated reasoning. And so you can build up these stories in your mind and that can reinforce bad information in the interest of preserving a prior belief. So, yes, it may not apply, the first reason may not apply, but your subsequent reasons that you have attached on that have been directionally motivated will continue to support this.
Absolutely.
Well, we could go on for probably the next 48 hours about this.
Or the next 4 weeks.
Well, the next 6 weeks. 6 weeks.
Next 6
weeks. We could go on about just vaccinations in general for forever, but we unfortunately are at the end of our time. So I just wanted to say again, thank you for joining us. We've missed you. I hope you've missed us. We're glad again to welcome our newest Beloiters. just very thrilling. Remember to invite your friends for next week. So we like to end by asking, what are you looking forward to? Because, you know, we're human beings living through a pandemic, and we've got to have something to motivate us to keep moving forward. So with that preamble, Phil, in 10 seconds or less, what are you looking forward to this week?
Can I use the same thing I was excited about on Monday? I'm excited to go on a camping trip this weekend. We're going up towards Park Falls. We're going to do some socially distance hiking with Kate Johnston, who will be joining us later this summer on Let's Talk Coronavirus. So we're going to camp, and we're going to meet up with Kate and do a little socially distanced hike.
Great. Ron, what are you looking forward to?
Well, in addition to the film course that I'm also going to be working on, I'm looking forward to actually digging further into now the second book in the Expanse series. Yeah, so there you are. Boom. Got through the first
Great. I'm excited for you. I haven't started reading them. I'm excited for a lot of things this week, but I'm excited actually because of something that's coming up next week when our first year students, our incoming students, are registering for their classes.
Oh, yes.
I've been working on this for a while, and I'm excited that it's happening. I'm excited for the college. I know this sounds pretty nerdy, but I'm just excited for the process to get started and what it,
I think a lot of people are, yeah.
yeah, and what it represents for us, especially in the midst of COVID. And so that's what I'm really excited for right now. So that starts on Tuesday. And
Take my first mod class.
And again, to the people who are who maybe haven't signed up for an appointment with your advisor yet, remember to do that. If you have questions about how to do that, you can contact me. So last thing before we go, again, thank you, but a reminder to our students in class, there's an assignment posted for Friday. Your reflection papers are due. I'm going to put together a little video about how to use Moodle, because I know that that's probably something new for everybody. So check your email. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Stay well.